by John Galsworthy. The Juryman. From Tolstoy. Don't you see, brother, I was reading yesterday the Gospel about Christ, the little Father. How he suffered, how he walked on the earth. I suppose you have heard about it? Indeed I have, replied Stepanuich. But we are people in darkness. We can't read. Mr. Henry Bosengate, of the London Stock Exchange, seated himself in his car that morning during the Great War with a sense of injury. Major in a volunteer corps, member of all the local committees, lending this very car to the neighboring hospital, at times even driving it himself for their benefit, subscribing to funds, so far as his diminished income permitted, he was conscious of being an asset to the country, and one whose time could not be wasted with impunity. To be summoned to sit on a jury at the local assizes, and not even the grand jury at that, it was in the nature of an outrage. Strong and upright, with hazel eyes and dark eyebrows, pinkish brown cheeks, a forehead white, well shaped, and getting high, with greyish hair glossy and well brushed, and a trim moustache, he might have been taken for that colonel of volunteers, which indeed he was in a fair way of becoming. His wife had followed him out under the porch, and stood bracing her supple body clothed in lilac linen. Red rambler roses formed a sort of crown to her dark head. Her ivory-colored face had in it just a suggestion of the Japanese. Mr. Bosengate spoke through the whir of the engine. "I don't expect to be late, dear. This business is ridiculous. There oughtn't to be any crime in these days." His wife, her name was Kathleen, smiled. She looked very pretty and cool, Mr. Bosengate thought. To him, bound on this dull and stuffy business, everything he owned seemed pleasant: the geranium beds beside the gravel drive, his long red brick house mellowing decorously in its creepers and ivy, the little clock tower over stables now converted to a garage, the Dovecot, masking at the other end the conservatory which adjoined the billiard room. Close to the red brick lodge, his two children, Kate and Harry, ran out from under the acacia trees and waved to him, scrambling bare-legged on the low red ivy-coloured wall which guarded his domain of 11 acres. Mr. Bosengate waved back, thinking, "Jolly couple! By Jove, they are!" Above their heads, through the trees, he could see right away to some downs, faint in the July heat haze, and he thought, pretty a spot as one could have got, so close to town. Despite the war, he had enjoyed these last 2 years more than any of the 10 since he built Charmley, and settled down to semi-rural domesticity with his young wife. There had been a certain piquancy, a savour added to existence by the country's peril, and all the public service and sacrifice it demanded. His chauffeur was gone, and one gardener did the work of 3. He enjoyed, positively enjoyed, his committee work. Even the serious decline of business and increase of taxation had not much worried one continually conscious of the national crisis and his own part therein. The country had wanted waking up, wanted a lesson in effort and economy, and the feeling that he had not spared himself in these strenuous times had given a zest to those quiet pleasures of bed and board which, at his age, even the most patriotic could retain with a good conscience. He had denied himself many things: new clothes, presents for Kathleen and the children, travel, and that pineapple house which he had been on the point of building when the war broke out. New wine, too, and cigars, and membership of the 2 clubs which he had never used in the old days. The hours had seemed fuller and longer, sleep better earned. Wonderful the things one could do without, when put to it. He turned the car into the high road, driving dreamily, for he was in plenty of time. The war was going pretty well now. He was no fool optimist, but now that conscription was in force, one might reasonably hope for its end within a year. Then there would be a boom, and one might let oneself go a little. Visions of theatres and supper with his wife at the Savoy afterwards, and cosy night drives back into the sweet-smelling country behind your own chauffeur once more, teased a fancy which even now did not soar beyond the confines of domestic pleasures. He pictured his wife in new dresses by Jay. She was 15 years younger than himself, and paid for dressing, as they said. He had always delighted, as men older than their wives will, in the admiration she excited from others not privileged to enjoy her charms. Her rather queer and ironical beauty, her cool, irreproachable wifeliness, was a constant balm to him. They would have dinner parties again, have their friends down from town, and he would once more enjoy sitting at the foot of the dinner table while Kathleen sat at the head, with the light soft on her ivory shoulders, behind flowers she had arranged in that original way of hers, and fruit which he had grown in his hothouses. Once more he would take legitimate interest in the wine he offered to his guests, once more stock that Chinese cabinet wherein he kept cigars. Yes, there was a certain satisfaction in these days of privation, if only from the anticipation they created. The sprinkling of villas had become continuous on either side of the high road, and women going out to shop, tradesmen's boys delivering victuals, young men in khaki, began to abound. Now and then a limping or bandaged form would pass, some bit of human wreckage, and Mr. Bosengate would think mechanically, "Another of those poor devils. Wonder if we've had his case before us." Running his car into the best hotel garage of the little town, he made his way leisurely over to the court. It stood back from the market-place, and was already lapped by a sea of persons having, as in the outer ring at race meetings, an air of business at which one must not be caught out, together with a soaked or flushed appearance. Mr. Bosengate could not resist putting his handkerchief to his nose. He had carefully drenched it with lavender water, and to this fact owed, perhaps, his immunity from the post of foreman on the jury, for, say what you will about the English, they have a deep instinct for affairs. He found himself second in the front row of the jury box, and through the odor of sanitas gazed at the judge's face expressionless up there, for all the world like a bewigged bust. His fellows in the box had that appearance of falling between two classes characteristic of jurymen. Mr. Bosengate was not impressed. On one side of him the foreman sat, a prominent upholsterer, known in the town as Gentleman Fox. His dark and beautifully brushed and oiled hair and moustache, his radiant linen, gold watch and chain, the white piping to his waistcoat, and a habit of never saying "sir," had long marked him out from commoner men. He undertook to bury people, too, to save them trouble, and was altogether superior. On the other side, Mr. Bosengate had one of those men who, except when they sit on juries, are never seen without a little brown bag and the appearance of having been interrupted in a drink. Pale and shiny, with large loose eyes shifting from side to side, he had an underdone voice and uneasy, flabby hands. Mr. Bosengate disliked sitting next to him. Beyond this commercial traveller sat a dark, pale young man with spectacles. Beyond him again a short old man with grey moustache, mutton chops, and innumerable wrinkles. And the front row was completed by a chemist. The three immediately behind Mr. Bosengate did not thoroughly master, But the three at the end of the second row he learned in their order of an oldish man in a grey suit, given to winking, an inanimate person with the mouth of a mustachioed codfish, over whose long bald crown 3 wisps of damp hair were carefully arranged, and a dried, dapperish, clean-shorn man whose mouth seemed terrified lest it should be surprised without a smile. Their first and second verdicts were recorded without the necessity for withdrawal, and Mr. Bosengate was already sleepy when the third case was called. The sight of khaki revived his drooping attention. But what a weedy-looking specimen! This prisoner had a truly nerveless, pitiable, dejected air. If he had ever had a military bearing, it had shrunk into him during his confinement. His ill-shaped brown tunic, whose little brass buttons seemed trying to keep smiling, struck Mr. Bosengate as ridiculously short, used though he was to such things. Absurd, he thought. Lumbago, just where they ought to be covered. Then the officer and gentleman stirred in him, and he added to himself, "Still, there must be some distinction made." The little soldier's visage had once perhaps been tan, but was now the colour of dark dough. His large brown eyes, with white showing below the iris, as so often in the eyes of very nervous people, wandered from face to face of judge, counsel, jury, and public. There were hollows in his cheeks, his dark hair looked damp, around his neck he wore a bandage. The commercial traveller on Mr. Bosengate's left turned and whispered, "Fellow to say, my hat, what a guy!" Mr. Bosengate pretended not to hear. He could not bear that fellow, and slowly wrote on a bit of paper, "Owen Lewis, Welsh." Well, he looked it. Not at all an English face. Attempted suicide. Not at all an English crime. Suicide implied surrender, a putting up of hands to fate, to say nothing of the religious aspect of the matter. And suicide in khaki seemed to Mr. Bosengate particularly abhorrent, like turning tail in face of the enemy, almost meriting the fate of a deserter. He looked at the prisoner, trying not to give way to this prejudice, and the prisoner seemed to look at him, though this perhaps was fancy. The counsel for the prosecution, a little alert, grey, decided man, above military age, began detailing the circumstances of the crime. Mr. Bosengate, though not particularly sensitive to atmosphere, could perceive a sort of current running through the court. It was as if jury and public were thinking rhythmically in obedience to the same unexpressed prejudice of which he himself was conscious. Even the Caesar-like pale face up there, presiding, seemed in its ironic serenity responding to that current. Gentlemen of the jury, before I call my evidence, I direct your attention to the bandage the accused is still wearing. He gave himself this wound with his army razor, adding, if I may say so, insult to the injury he was inflicting on his country. He pleads not guilty, and before the magistrates he said that absence from his wife was preying on his mind. The advocate's close lips widened. Well, gentlemen, if such an excuse is to weigh with us in these days, I'm sure I don't know what's to happen to the Empire. No, by George, thought Mr. Bosengate. The evidence of the first witness, a roommate who had caught the prisoner's hand, and of the sergeant who had at once been summoned, was conclusive, and he began to cherish a hope that they would get through without withdrawing, and he would be home before 5. But then a hitch occurred. The regimental doctor failed to respond when his name was called, and the judge, having for the first time that day showed himself capable of human emotion, intimated that he would adjourn until the morrow. Mr. Bosengate received the announcement with equanimity. He would be home even earlier. And gathering up the sheets of paper he had scribbled on, he put them in his pocket and got up. The would-be suicide was being taken out of the court, a shambling, drab figure with shoulders hunched. What good were men like that in these days? What good? The prisoner looked up. Mr. Bosengate encountered in full the gaze of those large brown eyes, with the white showing underneath. What a suffering, wretched, pitiful face! A man had no business to give you a look like that. The prisoner passed on down the stairs and vanished. Mr. Bosengate went out and across the market-place to the garage of the hotel where he had left his car. The sun shone fiercely, and he thought, "I must do some watering in the garden." He brought the car out and was about to start the engine when someone passing said, "Good evenin'. Seedy-looking beggar, that last prisoner, ain't he? We don't want men of that stamp." It was his neighbor on the jury, the commercial traveler, in a straw hat, with a little brown bag already in his hand, and the froth of an interrupted drink on his moustache. Answering curtly, "Good evening," and thinking, "Nor of yours, my friend," Mr. Bosengate started the car with unnecessary clamor. But, as if brought back to life by the commercial traveler's remark, the prisoner's figure seemed to speed along too, turning up at Mr. Bosengate his pitifully unhappy eyes. Want of his wife. Queer excuse that, for trying to put it out of his power ever to see her again. Why, half a loaf, even a slice, was better than no bread. Not many of that neurotic type in the army, thank heaven. The lugubrious figure vanished, and Mr. Bosengate pictured instead the form of his own wife bending over her Gloire de Dijon roses in the rosery, where she generally worked a little before tea now that they were short of gardeners. He saw her, as often he had seen her, raise herself and stand, head to one side, a gloved hand on her slender hip, gazing as if it were ironically from under drooped lids at buds which did not come out fast enough. And the word Céline, for he was something of a French scholar, shot through his mind. Kathleen, Céline. If he found her there when he got in, he would steal up on the grass and but what great care not to crease her dress or disturb her hair. If only she weren't quite so self-contained, he thought. It's like a cat you can't get near, not really near. The car returned faster than it had come down that morning, had already passed the outskirt villas, and was breasting the hill to where among fields and the old trees Charmley lay apart from commoner life. Turning into his drive, Mr. Bosengate thought with a certain surprise, "I wonder what she does think of. I wonder." He put his gloves and hat down in the outer hall, and went into the lavatory to dip his face in cool water and wash it with sweet-smelling soap, delicious revenge on the unclean atmosphere in which he had been stewing so many hours. He came out again into the hall, dazed by soap and the mellowed light, and a voice from halfway up the stairs said, "Daddy, look!" His little daughter was standing up there with one hand on the banisters. She scrambled onto them and came sliding down, her frock up to her eyes, and her holland knickers to her middle. Mr. Bosengate said mildly, "Well, that's elegant." "Tea's in the summer house. Mummy's waiting. Come on." With her hand in his, Mr. Bosengate went on, through the drawing-room, long and cool, with sun-blinds down, through the billiard-room, high and cool, through the conservatory, green and sweet-smelling, out onto the terrace and the upper lawn. He had never felt such sheer exhilarated joy in his home surroundings, so cool, glistening and green under the July sun. And he said: "Well, Kit, what have you been doing?" "I've fed my rabbits and Harry's, and we've been in the attic. Harry got his leg through the skylight." Mr. Bosengate drew in his breath with a hiss. "It's all right, Daddy. We got it out again. It's only grazed the skin, and we've been making swabs. I think 17. Mummy made 33. And then she went to the hospital. Did you put many men in prison?" Mr. Bosengate cleared his throat. The question seemed to him untimely. "Only 2. What's it like in prison, Daddy?" Mr. Bosengate, who had no more knowledge than his little daughter, replied in an absent voice: "Not very nice." They were passing under a young oak tree where the path wound round to the rosery and summer house. Something shot down and clawed Mr. Bosengate's neck. His little daughter began to hop and suffocate with laughter. "Oh, Daddy, aren't you caught? I led you on purpose." Looking up, Mr. Bosengate saw his small son lying along a low branch above him, like the leopard he was declaring himself to be, for fear of error, and thought blithely: "What an active little chap it is! Let me drop on your shoulders, Daddy, like they do on the deer." "Oh, yes, Daddy, do be a deer." Mr. Bosengate did not see being a deer. His hair had just been brushed. But he entered the rosery buoyantly between his offspring. His wife was standing precisely as he had imagined her, in a pale blue frock open at the neck, with a narrow black band around the waist, and little accordion pleats below. She looked her coolest. Her smile, when she turned her head, hardly seemed to take Mr. Bosengate seriously enough. He placed his lips below one of her half-drooped eyelids. She even smelled of roses. His children began to dance around their mother, and Mr. Bosengate, firmly held between them, was also compelled to do this, until she said: "When you've quite done, let's have tea." It was not the greeting he had imagined coming along in the car. Earwigs were plentiful in the summer house, used perhaps twice a year, but indispensable to every country residence, and Mr. Bosengate was not sorry for the excuse to get out again. Though all was so pleasant, he felt oddly restless, rather suffocated, and, lighting his pipe, began to move about among the roses, blowing tobacco at the greenfly. In wartime one was never quite idle. And suddenly he said: "We're trying a wretched Tommy at the Assizes." His wife looked up from a rose. "What for?" "Attempted suicide." "Why did he?" "Can't stand the separation from his wife." She looked at him, gave a low laugh, and said: "Oh, dear." Mr. Bosengate was puzzled. Why did she laugh? He looked round, saw that the children were gone, took his pipe from his mouth, and approached her. "You look very pretty," he said. "Give me a kiss." His wife bent her body forward from the waist, and pushed her lips out till they touched his moustache. Mr. Bosengate felt a sensation as if he had arisen from breakfast without having eaten marmalade. He mastered it and said: "That jury are a rum lot." His wife's eyelids flickered. "I wish women sat on juries." "Why?" "It would be an experience." Not the first time she had used that curious expression. Yet her life was far from dull, so far as he could see, with the new interests created by the war, and the constant calls on her time made by the perfection of their home life. She had a useful and busy existence. Again the random thought passed through him: "But she never tells me anything." And suddenly that lugubrious khaki-clad figure started up among the rose bushes. "We've got a lot to be thankful for," he said abruptly. "I must go to work." His wife raised one eyebrow, smiled, "And I to weep." Mr. Bosengate laughed. She had a pretty wit. And stroking his comely moustache where it had been kissed, he moved out into the sunshine. All the evening, throughout his labours, not inconsiderable, for this jury business had put him behind time, he was afflicted by that restless pleasure in his surroundings, would break off in mowing the lower lawn to look at the house through the trees, would leave his study and committee papers to cross into the drawing room and sniff its dainty fragrance, paid a special good-night visit to the children having supper in the schoolroom, pottered in and out from his dressing-room to admire his wife while she was changing for dinner, dined with his mind perpetually on the next course, talked volubly of the war, and in the billiard-room afterwards, smoking the pipe which had taken the place of his cigar, could not keep still, but roamed about, now in the conservatory, now in the drawing-room, where his wife and the governess were still making swabs. It seemed to him that he could not have enough of anything. About 11 o'clock he strolled out into the beautiful night, only just dark enough, under the new arrangement with time, and went down to the little round fountain below the terrace. His wife was playing the piano. Mr. Bosengate looked at the water and the flat dark water lily leaves which floated there, looked up at the house, where only narrow chinks of light showed, because of the lighting order. The dreamy music drifted out. There was a scent of heliotrope. He moved a few steps back and sat in the children's swing under an old lime tree. Jolly, blissful, in the warm, bloomy dark. Of all hours of the day, this before going to bed was perhaps the pleasantest. He saw the light go up in his wife's bedroom, unscreened for a full minute, and thought, "Aha! If I did my duty as a special, I would strafe her for that." She came to the window, her figure lighted, hands up to the back of her head, so that her bare arms gleamed. Mr. Bosengate wafted her a kiss, knowing he could not be seen. "Lucky chap," he mused. "She's a great joy." Up went her arm, down came the blind, the house was dark again. He drew a long breath. Another 10 minutes, he thought, then I'll go in and shut up. By Jove, the limes are beginning to smell already. And, the better to take in that acme of his well-being, he tilted the swing, lifted his feet from the ground, and swung himself toward the scented blossoms. He wanted to whelm his senses in their perfume, and closed his eyes. But instead of the domestic vision he expected, the face of the little Welsh soldier, hair-eyed, shadowy, pinched and dark and pitiful, started up with such disturbing vividness that he opened his eyes again at once. Curse! The fellow almost haunted one. Where would he be now, poor little devil? Lying in his cell thinking of his wife. Feeling suddenly morbid, Mr. Bosengate arrested the swing and stood up. Absurd! All his well-being and mood of warm anticipation had deserted him. A damned world, he thought. Such a lot of misery. Why should I have to sit in judgment on that poor beggar and condemn him? He moved up onto the terrace and walked briskly, to rid himself of this disturbance before going in. That commercial traveller chap, he thought, the rest of those fellows, they see nothing. And abruptly turning up the 3 stone steps, he entered the conservatory, locked it, passed into the billiard-room, and drank his barley water. One of the pictures was hanging crooked. He went up to put it straight. Still life, grapes and apples and lobsters. They struck him as odd for the first time. Why lobsters? The whole picture seemed dead and oily. He turned off the light and went upstairs, passing his wife's door, into his own room, and undressed. Clothed in his pajamas, he opened the door between the rooms. By the light coming from his own, he could see her dark head on the pillow. Was she asleep? No, not asleep, certainly. The moment of fruition had come, the crowning of his pride and pleasure in his home. But he continued to stand there. He had suddenly no pride, no pleasure, no desire. Nothing but a sort of dull resentment against everything. He turned back, shut the door, and slipping between the heavy curtains and his open window, stood looking out at the night. Full of misery, he thought. Full of damned misery. Filing into the jury box next morning, Mr. Bosengate collided slightly with a short juryman whose square figure and square head of stiff yellow-red hair he had only vaguely noticed the day before. The man looked angry, and Mr. Bosengate thought, an ill-bred dog, that. He sat down quickly, and to avoid further recognition of his fellows, gazed in front of him. His appearance on Saturdays was always military, by reason of the route march of his volunteer corps in the afternoon. Gentleman Fox, who belonged to the corps too, was also looking square, but that commercial traveller on his other side seemed more louche, and as if surprised in immorality than ever. Only the proximity of Gentleman Fox on the other side kept Mr. Bosengate from shrinking. Then he saw the prisoner being brought in, shadowy and dark behind the brightness of his buttons, and he experienced a sort of shock. This figure was so exactly that which had several times started up in his mind. Somehow he had expected a fresh sight of the fellow to dispel and disprove what had been haunting him, had expected to find him just an outside phenomenon, not, as it were, a part of his own life, and he gazed at the carven immobility of the judge's face, trying to steady himself, as a drunken man will by looking at a light. The regimental doctor, unabashed by the judge's comment on his absence the day before, gave his evidence like a man who had better things to do, and the case for the prosecution was forthwith rounded in by a little speech from counsel. The matter, he said, was clear as daylight. Those who wore His Majesty's uniform, charged with the responsibility and privilege of defending their country, were no more entitled to desert their regiments by taking their own lives than they were entitled to desert it in any other way. He asked for a conviction. Mr. Bosengate felt a sympathetic shuffle passing through all feet. The judge was speaking. "Prisoner, you can either go into the witness box and make your statement on oath, in which case you may be cross-examined on it, or you may make your statement there from the dock, in which case you will not be cross-examined. Which do you elect to do?" "From here, my lord." Seeing him now full face, and, as it might be, come to life in the effort to convey his feelings, Mr. Bosengate had suddenly a quite different impression of the fellow. It was as if his khaki had fallen off, and he had stepped out of his own shadow, a live and quivering creature. His pinched, clean-shaven face seemed to have an irregular, wilder, hairier look. His large, nervous brown eyes darkened and glowed. He jerked his shoulders, his arms, his whole body, like a man suddenly freed from cramp or a suit of armor. He spoke, too, in a quick, crisp, rather high voice, pinching his consonants a little, sharpening his vowels, like a true Welshman. "My lord and misters the jury," he said, "I was a hairdresser when the call came on me to join the army. I had a little home and a wife. I never thought what it would be like to be away from them. I surely never did. And I'm ashamed to be speaking it out like this. How it can squeeze and squeeze a man, how it can prey on your mind when you're nervous like I am. 'Tis not every one that cares for his home. There's lots of 'em never wants to see their wives again. But for me 'tis like being shut up in a cage, it is." Mr. Bosengate saw daylight between the skinny fingers of the man's hands thrown out with a jerk. "I cannot bear it shut up away from wife and home like what you are in the army. So when I took my razor that morning I was wild, and I wouldn't be here now but for that man catching my hand. There was no reason in it. I'm willing to confess that. It was foolish. But wait till you get feeling like what I was, and see how it draws you. Misters the jury, don't send me back to prison. It is worse still there. If you have wives, you will know what it is like for lots of us. Only some is more nervous than others. I swear to you, sirs, I could not help it." Again the little man flung out his hand. His whole thin body shook, and Mr. Bosengate felt the same sensation as when he drove his car over a dog. "Misters the jury, I hope you may never in your lives feel as I've been feeling." The little man ceased. His eyes shrank back into their sockets, his figure back into its mask of shadowy brown and gleaming buttons, and Mr. Bosengate was conscious that the judge was making a series of remarks, and very soon of being seated at a mahogany table in the jury's withdrawing room, hearing the voice of the man with hair like an Irish terrier's saying, "Didn't he talk through his hat, that little blighter?" Conscious, too, of the commercial traveller, still on his left, always on his left, mopping his brow and muttering, "Phew, it's hot in here today," while an effluvium as of an inside accustomed to whisky came from him. Then the man with the underlip and the 3 plastered whips of hair said, "Don't know why we withdrew, Mr. Foreman." Mr. Bosengate looked around to where, at the head of the table, Gentleman Fox sat, in defensive gentility and the little white piping to his waistcoat, saying blandly, "I shall be happy to take the sense of the jury." There was a short silence. Then the chemist murmured, "I should say he must have what they call claustrophobia." "Clauster fiddlesticks! The feller's a shirker, that's all. Missed his wife. Pretty excuse. Indecent, I call it." The speaker was the little wire-haired man, and emotion, deep and angry, stirred in Mr. Bosengate. That ill-bred little cur! He gripped the edge of the table with both hands. "I think it's damned natural," he muttered. But almost before the words had left his lips he felt dismay. What had he said? He, nearly a colonel of volunteers, endorsing such a want of patriotism. And hearing the commercial traveller murmuring, "'Ear, 'ear," he reddened violently. The wire-headed man said roughly, "There's too many of these blighted shirkers, and too much pampering of them." The turmoil in Mr. Bosengate increased. He remarked in an icy voice, "I agree to no verdict that'll send the man back to prison." At this a real tremor seemed to go round the table, as if they all saw themselves sitting there through lunch-time. Then the large grey-haired man, given to winking, said, "Oh, come, sir! After what the judge said? Come, sir! What do you say, Mr. Foreman?" Gentleman Fox, as who should say, "This is excellent value, but I don't want to press it on you," answered, "We are only concerned with the facts. Did he or did he not try to shorten his life?" "Of course he did. Said so himself." Mr. Bosengate heard the wire-haired man snap out, and from the following murmur of assent, he alone abstained. Guilty. Well, yes. There was no way out of admitting that. but his feelings revolted against handing that poor little beggar over to the tender mercy of his country's law. His whole soul rose in arms against agreeing with that ill-bred little cur and the rest of this job lot. He had an impulse to get up and walk out, saying, "Settle it your own way. Good morning." "It seems, sir," Gentleman Fox was saying, "that we're all agreed to guilty, except yourself. If you will allow me, I don't see how you can go behind what the prisoner himself admitted." Thus brought up to the very guns, Mr. Bosengate, red in the face, thrust his hands deep into the side pockets of his tunic, and staring straight before him, said, "Very well. On condition we recommend him to mercy." "What do you say, gentlemen? Shall we recommend him to mercy?" "'Ear, 'ear!" burst from the commercial traveller, and from the chemist came the murmur, "No harm in that." "Well, I think there is. They shoot deserters at the front, and we let this fellow off. I'd hang the cur." Mr. Bosengate stared at that little wire-haired brute. "Haven't you any feeling for others?" he wanted to say. "Can't you see that this poor devil suffers tortures?" But the sheer impossibility of doing this before 10 other men brought a slight sweat out on his face and hands, and in agitation he smote the table a blow with his fist. The effect was instantaneous. Everybody looked at the wire-haired man as if saying, "Yes, you've gone a bit too far there." The little brute stood it for a moment, then muttered surlily, "Well, commend him to mercy if you like. I don't care." "That's right. They never pay any attention to it," said the grey-haired man, winking heartily, and Mr. Bosengate filed back with the others into court. But when from the jury box his eyes fell once more on the hare-eyed figure in the dock, he had his worst moment yet. Why should this poor wretch suffer so, for no fault, no fault, while he, and these others, and that snapping counsel, and the Caesar-like judge up there, went off to their women and their homes, blithe as bees, and probably never thought of him again? And suddenly he was conscious of the judge's voice. "You will go back to your regiment, and endeavour to serve your country with better spirit. You may thank the jury that you are not sent to prison, and your good fortune that you were not at the front when you tried to commit this cowardly act. You are lucky to be alive." A policeman pulled the little soldier by the arm. His drab figure, with eyes fixed and lustreless, passed down and away. From his very soul Mr. Bosengate wanted to lean out and say, "Cheer up! Cheer up! I understand." It was nearly 10 o'clock that evening before he reached home, motoring back from the route march. His physical tiredness was abated, for he had partaken of a snack and a whisky and soda at the hotel. But mentally he was in a curious mood. His body felt appeased, his spirit hungry. Tonight he had a yearning, not for his wife's kisses, but for her understanding. He wanted to go to her and say, "I've learnt a lot today, found out things I never thought of. Life's a wonderful thing, Kate, a thing one can't live all to oneself, a thing one shares with everybody, so that when another suffers, one suffers too. It's come to me that what one has doesn't matter a bit. It's what one does, and how one sympathizes with other people. It came to me in the most extraordinary vivid way when I was on that jury, watching that poor little rat of a soldier in his trap. It's the first time I've ever felt the Spirit of Christ, you know. It's a wonderful thing, Kate, wonderful. We haven't been close, really close, you and I, so that we each understand what the other is feeling. It's all in that, you know, understanding, sympathy. It's priceless. When I saw that poor little devil taken down and sent back to his regiment to begin his sorrows all over again, wanting his wife, thinking and thinking of her just as you know I would be thinking and wanting you, I felt what an awful outside sort of life we lead, never telling each other what we really think and feel, never being really close. I dare say that little chap and his wife keep nothing from each other, live each other's lives. That's what we ought to do. Let's get to feeling that what really matters is understanding and loving, and not only just saying it as we all do, those fellows on the jury and even that poor devil of a judge. What an awful life judging one's fellow creatures. When I left that poor little Tommy this morning, and ever since, I've longed to get back here quietly to you and tell you about it, and make a beginning. There's something wonderful in this, and I want you to feel it as I do, because you mean such a lot to me. This was what he wanted to say to his wife, not touching or kissing her, just looking into her eyes, watching them soften and glow as they surely must, and catching the infection of his new ardor. And he felt unsteady, fearfully unsteady, with the desire to say it all as it should be said, swiftly, quietly, with the truth and fervor of his feeling. The hall was not lit up, for daylight still lingered under the new arrangement. He went towards the drawing room, but from the very door shied off to his study, and stood irresolute under the picture of a man catching a flea, Dutch school, which had come down to him from his father. The governess would be in there with his wife. He must wait. Essential to go straight to Kathleen and pour it all out, or he would never do it. He felt as nervous as an undergraduate going in for his viva voce. This thing was so big, so astoundingly and unexpectedly important. He was suddenly afraid of his wife, afraid of her coolness and her grace, and that something Japanese about her, of all those attributes he had been accustomed to admire most, afraid, as it were, of her attraction. He felt young tonight, almost boyish. Would she see that he was not really 15 years older than herself, and she not really a part of his collection, of all the admirable appointments of his home, but a companion spirit to one who wanted a companion badly? In this agitation of his soul, he could keep still no more than he could last night in the agitation of his senses, and he wandered into the dining room. A dainty supper was set out there, sandwiches and cake, whiskey and the cigarettes, even an early peach. Mr. Bosengate looked at this peach with sorrow rather than disgust. The perfection of it was of a piece with all that had gone before this new and sudden feeling. Its delicious bloom seemed to heighten his perception of the hedge around him, that hedge of the things he so enjoyed, carefully planted and tended these many years. He passed it by uneaten and went to the window. Out there all was darkening, the fountain, the lime tree, the flower beds, and the fields below, with the Jersey cows who would come to your call. Darkening slowly, losing form, blurring into soft blackness, vanishing, but there none the less, all there, the hedge of his possessions. He heard the door of the dining room open, the voices of his wife and the governess in the hall, going up to bed. If only they didn't look in here! If only! The voices ceased. He was safe now, had but to follow in a few minutes to make sure of Kathleen alone. He turned round and stared down the length of the dark dining room, over the rosewood table, to where, in the mirror above the sideboard at the far end, his figure bathed, a stain, a mere blurred shadow. He made his way down to it along the table edge, and stood before himself as close as he could get. His throat and the roof of his mouth felt dry with nervousness. He put out his finger and touched his face in the glass. "You're an ass," he thought. "Pull yourself together and get over it. She will see. Of course she will." He swallowed, smoothed his moustache, and walked out. Going up the stairs, his heart beat painfully. But he was in for it now, and marched straight into her room. Dressed only in a loose blue wrapper, she was brushing her dark hair before the glass. Mr. Bosengate went up to her and stood there silent, looking down. The words he had thought of were like a swarm of bees buzzing in his head, yet not one would fly from between his lips. His wife went on brushing her hair under the light which shone on her polished elbows. She looked up at him from beneath one lifted eyebrow. "Well, dear? Tired?" With a sort of vehemence the single word "No" passed out. A faint, a quizzical smile flitted over her face. She shrugged her shoulders ever so gently. That gesture he had seen it before, and in desperate desire to make her understand, he put his hand on her uplifted arm. "Kathleen, stop! Listen to me." His fingers tightened in his agitation and eagerness to make his great discovery known. But before he could get out a word, he became conscious of that cool, round arm, conscious of her eyes half closed, sliding round at him, of her half smiling lips, of her neck under the wrapper. And he stammered: "I want I must Kathleen, I " She lifted her shoulders again in that little shrug. Yes, I know. All right." A wave of heat and shame, and of God knows what, came over Mr. Bosengate. He fell on his knees and pressed his forehead to her arm, and he was silent, more silent than the grave. Nothing came from him but two long sighs. Suddenly he felt her hand stroke his cheek, compassionately, it seemed to him. She made a little movement towards him. Her lips met his, and he remembered nothing but that. In his own room, Mr. Bosengate sat at his wide open window smoking a cigarette. There was no light. Moths went past, the moon was creeping up. He sat very calm, puffing the smoke out into the night air. Curious thing, life! Curious world! Curious forces in it, making one do the opposite of what one wished. Always making one do the opposite, it seemed. The furtive light from that creeping moon was getting hold of things down there, stealing in among the boughs of the trees. There's something ironical, he thought, which walks about. Things don't come off as you think they will. I tried, but one doesn't change like that all of a sudden, it seems. Fact is, life's too big a thing for one. All the same, I'm not the man I was yesterday. Not quite. He closed his eyes, and in one of those flashes of vision which come when the senses are at rest, he saw himself, as it were, far down below, down on the floor of a street narrow as a grave, high as a mountain, a deep, dark slit of a street, walking down there, a black midget of a fellow, among other black midgets, his wife, and the little soldier, the judge, and those jury chaps, fantoches straight up on their tiny feet, wandering down there in that dark, infinitely tall, and narrow street. Too much for one, he thought. Too high for one. No getting on top of it. We've got to be kind, and help one another, and not expect too much, and not think too much. That's all. And squeezing out his cigarette, he took 6 deep breaths of the night air and got into bed. End of tale number 4. Recording by David Wales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.